In the center of the planet, there sleeps the great Earth Dragon, a being of incomprehensible might. So immense is his power that even his dreams change the world, granting special individuals on the surface extraordinary powers beyond those of mortal men. This is the Earth of the Mirage universe, and you're listening to the Mirage Barrage. One thing about science is that sometimes you need to see something completely break in order to know how it works. This is also true for medical science. Sometimes, to understand how the body works in order to heal someone, you need to see, for instance, a not working body. Today, we are fortunate enough to have a myriad of technologies that let us examine people without hurting them, from MRIs to X-rays, CT scans, and many more. Still, a lot of our basic knowledge on human anatomy first was discovered by people looking at, well, dead bodies. Of course, obtaining bodies isn't just something that you can go and do. One glaring and morbid example of this is in early 19th century Scotland. Edinburgh was a centre for anatomical research, and because of this, they soon found themselves with a problem. They needed more bodies than they could legally obtain. Some professionals, looking for subjects for dissections and lectures, were willing to look the other way if a body found itself into their hands. This led to a couple of aspiring entrepreneurs finding a new business niche. William Hare was renting out a space to a man who one day turned up dead. Bemoaning the lack of rent to his friend William Burke, Burke suggested that they sell the body to a local anatomist. They did this, and then had an idea. You couldn't just stumble on bodies, but you could make some. The Burke and Hare murders are a rather infamous chapter in medical history, but I bring them up to drive home my point. If you want to learn more about the body, sometimes you need to study those that don't work anymore. Now that's a problem if, say, there aren't that many people like you around, and even fewer who have died. Which might just happen if, say, you're an alien superhero who was recently struck in the head with a radioactive bullet. Greta Alhross was just such an alien. Right now she was sitting on a chair, her chin resting on a, chin rest, which was connected to an ocular device with several lenses, which swung out on a mechanical arm. It was rather similar to those devices you might see at an eye doctor's to check how you would see with different lens adjustments, though the primary lens on this device was much longer and it had several cords connecting to a nearby monitor and computer. "Ready," Dr. Phelps said, giving a thumbs up to Greta. Her left eye looking into the big lens, she focused on a metal panel about 50 feet out. Concentrating, she sent a burst of energy to that eye, and suddenly a brilliant blue laser beam shot forth, went through the lenses directly ahead of it, and shot towards the metal sensor plate at the end of the long room. When it made contact, an electric hiss filled the room. "Steady," Dr. Phelps said. The beam continued into the plate until a green light lit up and Dr. Phelps raised a thumbs up. The hissing suddenly stopped as Greta released her concentration and the laser vanished. Dr. Phelps walked over to the computer hooked to the sensor plate and ocular device. "Well, how's it look?" Greta asked, a bit anxious. She didn't reveal that she felt winded from the effort. She forced herself to take even breaths in what she thought was a normal rate and depth. At full power, this would have been a piece of cake. Phelps didn't need to get worried about a little exhaustion. No sense risking an overreaction and a longer stay in the hospital. "Your output was a little lower than the control," he said. "But only just. It's within a healthy range." Greta sighed with relief, quickly trying to return her breathing to normal. "Let's try the other eye." After a brief interlude in which Dr. Phelps and the technicians adjusted the machine for Greta's right eye, the instruments powered up again and Dr. Phelps gave the signal. The beam was identical to the one from her left eye, but instead of the bright, healthy blue, it emitted a poisonous green light. It hit the plate, which hissed again, and after a couple of seconds, Dr. Phelps once more signaled for her to stop. He looked at his display. Frowning, he muttered something to himself. "What's up?" Greta asked, a little more exhausted now. She desperately hoped there hadn't been a noticeable drop in power. "I think we had an equipment malfunction," Dr. Phelps said. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," Greta lied, concentrating hard on her breathing. "Then let's try one more time." After flicking a few switches, he once more gave Greta the go-ahead. Concentrating hard while trying to keep her body relaxed, Greta once more shot energy from her right pupil. "Stop! Stop!" Dr. Phelps shouted. Greta did so, and before she could say anything, the doctor was there, examining her eye. "Just hold still. What's happening?" Hold still, I need to see... Oh, good. What? Dr. Phelps looked a little pale as he stepped away from her. He shook his head. The instruments were reading xenocyte radiation from your last beam. What? Greta clasped a hand to her eye in terror. I checked the machine, and it's working normally, and yet your eye shows absolutely no damage, even minor, from such a blast. What? I mean, how? You're saying I shot xenocyte radiation from my eye? It looks like it. Then how am I okay? Dr. Phelps shook his head again. That's just it. I have no idea. But even such a short exposure should have left some damaged tissue. But your eye looks as healthy as it's ever been. How could something like this happen? I can only guess, Greta, and as much as I've gotten used to speculating about Ashvelian biology, this time I'm really going out on a limb. But if I had to guess, based on the scans we've seen of your head, some of the xenocyte bullet fragments must have made their way to your eye or your optical nerves. When energy from your beams pass through the remnants, they emit the radiation, similar to how Captain Cosmos' suit worked. Greta held back her fear just enough to let that comment sink in. Jack used xenocyte radiation to make himself stronger. Is that happening to me? Dr. Phelps shook his head worriedly. No, the beams are different frequencies, and the radiation emitted is different as well. Captain Cosmos' suit emitted a beneficial version of the radiation. The radiation created by your eye is decidedly less so. It's of the toxic variety. Greta swallowed. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, but she put on a brave face. Well, it might be the dangerous kind, but you saw no damage. Clearly there's no danger. Greta, we can't know that, Dr. Phelps warned. It could be your eye is hardened against the radiation, but if it encountered prolonged exposure, the cells might begin to break down. We just don't know at this point. Greta closed her eyes. A lot of implications came to mind, but the one that grappled its way to the forefront of her mind was, how much longer will I have to stay here then? Dr. Phelps sighed, understanding. When you work with superheroes, you get used to the constant desire to push aside their own well-being and get back into the field. While we still have to do several more tests in regards to your right eye, we can do those on an outpatient basis. You're still on track for release so long as you don't use your right eye beam. Done, Greta said. It would be no sweat to avoid using the potentially dangerous power. Dr. Phelps didn't even need to add it on as a condition of her release. As far as she was concerned, the less playing around with xenocyte radiation she did, the better. There is one other matter. Dr. Phelps hesitated. Okay, what's that? Your case here has brought to light how little we know about Ashvelian biology. If we're to have any chance at treating your condition, or any new curveballs we might encounter, we need more information. Okay, but I'm no scientist. I mean, if you want to do more tests, and it pained her to say this, I can do that. She figured it was better not to fight the doctors on this one and hoped that these two could be done on an outpatient basis. No, there's really not much more we can hope to get from scans, Dr. Phelps said. We have as much as we're going to get, both from before you were injured and after. We need a new source of information, of research. What do you mean? Greta asked. She had become suspicious because of Dr. Phelps' suddenly cautious tone. This is uncomfortable for all of us, believe me, he said, and I wish there was a better time to bring it up. But considering what we've discovered today, it's best we don't wait. Greta, now that Jack's dead... Wait, you aren't thinking about... An autopsy would give us a lot more insight into Ashvelian biology and answer a lot of questions we have. No, Greta said flatly. Greta, I know this is uncomfortable, but just hear me out. Absolutely not. We already had the funeral. I know, Dr. Phelps sighed. But he hasn't been buried yet. Sylvia's setting up a private ceremony for the burial. Before then, we could perform the autopsy. Sylvia was preparing a burial? A small ceremony, probably just like what Jack wanted. How had Greta let it come to this? She should have been the one to think of this, but of course it was Sylvia who... That wasn't important right now. I'm not letting you cut up his body for some science experiment, Greta hissed. Greta, it's nothing like that, Dr. Phelps said gently. He was my friend too, and we'd treat his body with the utmost respect. The only reason I'm suggesting this is that we need information now. It would be to help his adopted daughter, and I'm sure he would want that. No. Greta couldn't explain her refusal, but it just seemed wrong to cut up the hero's body. No one is desecrating his body or his memory, Dr. Phelps reassured her again. This is the only way I know to get the answers we need to help you. What do you think Jack would say if he could talk to you right now? Greta bit her tongue. She knew what his answer would be, but it seemed wrong for her to be the one to say it, like she was somehow taking advantage of him or something. So why are you asking me? Legally, you are his next of kin. Greta scoffed in disbelief. Don't you think that's like a conflict of interest or something? Possibly, Dr. Phelps admitted. That's why we'd also want the consent of your sisters and brother. Sylvia, Candace, and Jeremy would all probably say yes if they knew it would help her, and that just infuriated Greta all the more. They couldn't answer honestly if they wanted to. Just like Jack, they would have made the obvious play, even if it meant sacrificing something important. And somehow, it was important to Greta that this not be done. I'm not dying, am I? She finally asked. Your condition is stable for now, but then the answer is no. I will never give my consent. But Greta, if something changes in my condition, then we can talk again. But unless it's life-threatening, the answer will still be no. Greta, Dr. Phelps said in a grim and determined voice that Greta knew meant he was uncomfortable, but through years of the most difficult medical practice had conditioned himself to push through his own discomfort. It will only be harder if we have to exhume the body to do the autopsy. Greta hadn't consciously thought about that, but as soon as Dr. Phelps had said it, she thought, I know. Some secret part of her had been hoping that once Jack was buried, the others would also become opposed to the autopsy, and that this conversation could be tabled indefinitely. This wasn't her usual way of thinking, but she knew this autopsy would somehow be profane, and that it had to be stopped, no matter what. My answer is no, Doctor, was all she said aloud, and with a clear note of finality that left no room for argument. Dr. Phelps stared at her for a moment, clearly unhappy with the result, but knowing he was helpless to change it. At least for the moment. He straightened. Very well then, let's get you back to your room. There was only a day left before she was free to leave, and Greta was determined to prove that she was in condition to do it. She spent an uncomfortable session on a treadmill, something that would have been ludicrous to put a human patient through, but was one of the very few ways to truly test an Ashevilian's recovery. She ran herself nearly exhausted, and Dr. Phelps was clearly concerned at that, but she had outdone all the performance requirements. Similarly, her lab work all came back excellent, much to her relief. That had been the part that most concerned her because it was the single thing she couldn't do anything about. She had carefully made sure to eat well, hoping that would give her a bit of extra karma which would help her out with the tests. Either it worked, or she didn't need to worry in the first place, and she was elated at the results. The one thing she came to hate the most was the thing she most underestimated. A little apparatus designed to ensure her lungs were working properly. All she had to do was blow into a tube which would raise a cap inside another transparent vertical tube. The higher she could get it with a single exhale, the better. To her fury, even as she breathed out as hard as she could, the thing barely rose halfway. She was certain the doctors had screwed something up calibrating it for an Ashevilian. She was breathing fine, never felt short of breath, and heck, she had been running on a treadmill without serious problems. That had to count for something. Yet the doctors insisted she get it all the way to the very top. Again, this was infuriating because the task was apparently so simple and she felt just fine. Yet every time she breathed into the tube, she couldn't get the darn thing to rise more than 3/4 when she absolutely drained the breath from her. Worse yet, they made her do this several times a day. They had made clear that she could not leave until she got the little cap to rise to the top. Even though she had done excellently in all other tests and was feeling fine, they were going to hold her back for another day because of this one stupid thing. Absolutely infuriating. She wanted to believe that this was somehow Dr. Phelps punishing her for her decision about the autopsy, but as soon as she thought that, she felt ashamed. Dr. Phelps was a good man and wouldn't do something that petty. The night she had promised herself she was going to be released, she just managed to raise the cap to its maximum, just barely, and she took a big gasp of air in as soon as it was done. But Dr. Phelps didn't look all that convinced. He wanted her to stay overnight and then be released in the morning if she was ready. Greta hated the idea, but as she was still catching her breath, she couldn't really argue the point. She sullenly went back into her bed, but not before snagging a laptop. When the nurses asked what she was doing, she promptly informed them that she was starting to make her suspects list. While she was recovering, she hadn't had the time to really think about who had done this to her, but since she was supposed to be out already, she was going to act like it. Besides, it would distract her from being in the antiseptic-smelling room. She glanced through the pages of well-known and documented criminals and dangerous supers. There were far too many to count, and her mind was getting tired just looking at the list. Before long, she realized she wasn't going to make any decent progress in narrowing the list down. But she did have one idea. While many villains who joined in the Battle of Armageddon were rewarded with pardons, some of the more notorious were not, and were immediately arrested upon the battle's conclusion. Many of them were being held on Empire Island in the Supermax fortress built to house supercriminals. Tomorrow, when she was finally out of this place, she would arrange for a little visit. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was Sylvia. Greta decided that she was already sleeping. Dr. Phelps was in a slightly better mood when he released Greta. It was clear he was anxious to be able to do more for her, but at the same time he was convinced she was well enough for the outside world. So Greta immediately threw on the exercise gear she used at the Ashvelian's Manor and made contact with Empire Island. The orange and navy blue outfit with the Super Scout logo on it would have to serve as her temporary costume. Its more casual nature somehow felt more right given the circumstances, maybe just because it was quite comfortable. But somehow it seemed to fit her weakened state, and seemed appropriate since she couldn't wear her Scouter Supreme nor her Super Scout outfit anymore. Candace had also stopped by her hospital bed for a brief time. She brought a card from Jeremy, who was too busy with the Stormbreakers to get away. Greta somehow suspected that wasn't true. When things got tough, Jeremy preferred to dive into his work. Besides, the Stormbreakers were unlikely to keep him from his family, even pressed as they were. They could do without him for 15 minutes. But Greta didn't mind. Candace, the new Super Scout, was also somehow more credible with her apologies about taking Greta's former superhero name. Greta and Candace hadn't spent as much time together as the others in the family, but Greta liked her. Their interests didn't much overlap, with Candace being a bit of a gearhead and a nerd, but she was kind and friendly in a very direct, clumsy way. It was hard to hold anything against her. Greta had decided not to contact any of them when setting up her meeting with the high-risk prisoners. This was something she needed to do herself, to prove that she could get back in the game, even if it was only by talking. The guards at Empire Island seemed a bit concerned at first, probably because of the bandage pasted on her forehead, but Greta quickly assumed her old role, and the confidence and poise were enough to assure them that she knew what she was doing. They let her in, and she got to work. She was sitting across from Gorger. When the great Earth Dragon dreamed, it wasn't always a pleasant thing. Some that were transformed by the dragon's power came out as monsters. If they hadn't been in appearance, they had been in mentality. The dragon just made their outsides match. And sometimes it made them even worse. Gorger, depending on how you viewed him, either had no head, or his head was absurdly large. He had no head where most people did, that much was obvious. But his 8-foot stature meant you could easily look into his giant empty eyes and sharp teeth of his mouth. His torso was both torso and head for him. It was a giant metal skull-like thing. Roughly where the pectoral muscles would be, he had hollow skull eyes which formed an impenetrable blackness. A non-reflective surface blocking off light partway through, sealing the back of the cavities from the outside world. And where his abdomen would be, there was simply his horrifically large mouth. Taller than it was wide, it was made of thin metal teeth that could mash anything into a thick paste. And he really would eat anything, especially his delicacy of choice. People. "I want to know who shot me," Greta said simply, pointing at her head.
"I heard about that, but why do you think I know?"
Gorger responded nonchalantly. "You know just about everyone in here, and you like dirty secrets. If they haven't bragged to you, you've weaseled it out of them," Greta replied. Gorger laughed.
"Sorry, doll, I can't help you."
Classic question. Can't or won't?
Can't. Why exactly do you think I would be so eager to hand over the info, even if I did have it?
Because if you want any chance of getting out of here, you'll help me out. I'm sure it's getting confining, especially after all the help you gave us in the battle, only to get thrown back here in the end.
There are a lot of tykes that are upset at getting this as a reward in here, all right? But I ain't one of them. I figure this is how the world works.
That's awfully forward-thinking of you. You're comfortable in here?
Comfortable? Give me a diet of pasty tofu or whatever mush they've got me set up with. I ain't comfortable, but I also ain't surprised. I was always going to wind up back in here. No way were they going to let me back on the streets. I eat people, don't you know?
Greta shook her head. I guess at least you understand. But I'm not convinced you know nothing in this matter.
I'm not such a bad guy,
Gorger said, which Greta couldn't decide if it was sarcasm or not.
Tell you what, you give me like 50 pounds of raw beef, and I'll tell you all I know.
50 pounds.
A guy's gotta eat. A live cow would be better, but I figure they won't go for that. What do you say?
All right, deal, Greta said carefully, if your info's good.
I was telling the truth before. No one in here's bragged about doing it, but there's a lot of speculation going around. A few of us have discussed some possibilities.
Is this what you guys have for water cooler talk? Gorger shrugged.
Somebody pulled it off, and we gotta talk about something. Anyway, the first guy we think of who has that kind of xenocyte to waste is Anton Griffin.
Naturally, though it's not quite his style. A bit direct for him.
I was thinking something similar, but you never know. Anyway, I asked a couple of guys who were familiar with his work.
Contractors?
Not that you can prove. And before you ask, no, they ain't gonna testify. They'd be dead before the first interview was over, and they know it. Anyway, I talked to them, and they were positive they would have known if Griffin was planning this sort of operation, and they swear up and down that it wasn't one of his plans.
Comforting. Let's say I believe that.
You do what you want with the information, but I'm talking about some close associates. Anyway, if it weren't Anton, we started trying to figure out who else might have xenocyte in the grudge.
Long list.
That it is. I bet we got just as nowhere as you with that line of thinking. But we got Tang in here.
The sniper?
The same. He didn't do it, but he told us some interesting speculation. If you can get him talking, tricky in it, he can go on about his trade for a while. Anyway, he says to us that shot was damn near impossible. First, you need to know where you'd be flying around. Second, you have your usual sniper problems, wind, Coriolis effect, so on, so on. Third, you've got a bunch of new problems from the metal moon falling down, like a bunch of different crosswinds and the new gravity changing things.
Go on.
Well, he figures only the very best sharpshooters in the world can make that, and I mean the very best. What's more, they have to have a specific setup. High-powered rifle is obvious, but they'd also need a good view of the battlefield. A 360 view that still has cover. Probably somewhere high, but without a lot of other high buildings or hills around to obstruct the shot. It would also have to be somewhere where you could anticipate the heaviest fighting was going to be. The heaviest because that's what it would take to draw out an Eshvelian. Throw those together with where you were hit, and it narrows down the location where the sniper must have been perched. And,
he went on before Greta could speak,
he's betting that you weren't specifically the target.
Oh, really?
Tang has two theories. First, the sniper was after your buddy Cece.
Greta's heart skipped a beat. Of course it made sense, but the thought that the bullet had actually been meant for him. To think what would have happened if the sniper found his mark. There would be no one left to stop the descent to the metal moon. Second, Greta asked, keeping her voice level.
Well, if they weren't gunning for the most well-known Eshvelian, they might have been going for any and all of them.
That sent another shudder up her spine. The way Gorger had said it. Somehow it was worse than if they had just been targeting heroes. Somehow what he implied was some sort of vendetta against the species, some genocidal hatred that was all the worse by its precise implementation. Well, that's all good and well, except I could have learned all of this from our own snipers and analysts. You aren't giving me any information I couldn't find elsewhere.
Hold your horses,
Gorger said.
Sure, maybe you could have gotten all that elsewhere, but you wouldn't get this. I got a list of snipers it definitely wasn't.
Greta raised a dark eyebrow.
Tang and some of the others in here have a pretty good idea of where all the snipers are, if they're working on something else, or if they were just out of the country. They know some of the rumors your boys in blue don't.
All right, spill.
I get my beef?
Why not?
Then grab a pen.
Greta was sitting next to Diego Diaz, aka Dauntless Dynamo, in one of the Stormbreaker's backup bases. He, too, liked alliteration, probably from hanging out with Jack a little too much. Diego scrolled through a database of criminal supers, checking those that had powers related to accuracy, as well as a list of mortal snipers at the top of their game. Well, our buddy Gorger here scratched about half the list, Diego said. That still leaves a lot of suspects. Greta sighed. It's a start, she said between clenched teeth. You sure you don't want me to get Jeremy in on this? I'm sure, Greta answered, gripping the back of Diego's chair just a bit harder than necessary. Even though she was feeling a bit winded after her light interrogation of the supervillain, she was still well above human performance. Though still, she had no desire to let her brother, who might see through her tough exterior, to accompany her. This was something she needed to prove, and something she wanted to do alone. Someone had taken half of her power away. That person had made things personal. Diego shrugged. Well, I can knock a couple more off the list. I can tell you they weren't in the country either. Greta had come to Diego because while all of the Stormbreakers kept a close eye on potential threats, none were as meticulous or as keen on such a prospect as Dauntless Dynamo. This was because he had his own demon he was trying to track down. 2 years ago, while Diego was rushing between missions on an intercontinental sprint, a mysterious black figure had appeared. To keep pace with Diego was one thing, but to be able to communicate to him while at that speed was another. With the wind whipping past at an extreme rate, Diego used his helmet to stay in contact with his team. Even if they could have kept up with him, their words would be drowned out, hence the helmet and radio. But this figure had no such problem. He spoke with Diego telepathically. He warned him that exactly 4 years from that day, 2 years from the present now, Diego would be killed. He didn't explain how, only told Diego to take every precaution possible. Diego wasn't sure whether or not to believe him, but he had been so specific on the date, May 6th, 2022, that he feared it might be. But no matter how he tried, he couldn't find anyone with the power combination that fit this mysterious apparition. He had upgraded and maintained the hero's database of threats, and still did in the hopes that one day someone would appear that matched. Then he could finally figure out what this event the mysterious figure had talked about was, if it was anything at all. But for now, he was putting his intimate familiarity with villains to use by helping Greta narrow down her suspects. What about that one guy connected to No Man? Greta asked. Gorger said the shot was tricky because of gravity and wind from the metal moon, but can't that psycho make things travel in a straight line no matter what? I know who you're talking about. Yeah, he can imbue things he touches with momentum that can't be stopped or altered, but he's not on the list. Why not? Sounds pretty plausible to me. For his power to work, he has to touch the projectile just before it's sent on its way. That's why he uses a bow and arrow. There's no way he could load a bullet fast enough to take a shot while his power is in effect. It lasts like half a second at most. Oh, so not him. Greta paused to think while scanning the list. Wait, Gorger said something about Anton Griffin. He has access to a lot of xenocyte, Diego agreed. I can cross-reference by those who likely worked with her for him. No, do the opposite. Remove those who have likely worked with Griffin. You're gonna have to walk me through that one. Gorger says it wasn't a Griffin op. It might be hard to believe, but it also might be true. If Griffin did use someone he's worked with before, it's more likely that Gorger would have heard a rumor about it. If Griffin didn't keep it under lock and key, and if Gorger isn't lying, Diego pointed out. Yeah, assuming that, Greta agreed sullenly. This was the best she had so far, and even it was a bit thin. Diego entered in the parameters and filtered out more possible suspects. Still, they were left with 30-some names. There's a lot of jerks out there, Greta sighed. Don't I know it? The database has everyone, even if they haven't been active in a while, or even if this is outside their usual MO. I could try filtering out those. Hold off on that, Greta said. She hated going through the research and paperwork part of being a hero, but had long since learned of its importance. It might be time to go through each of them rather than continue tossing out suspects on tenuous guesses. They had enough of those already. There was a knock on the door. Before Greta finished turning around to ask who it was, Diego was already glancing through the now cracked open door. Oh hey, join the party, he said, holding the door open. Greta's fist clenched as she saw Sylvia walk in, once more in uniform. Sylvia. What a coincidence meeting you here, Greta said. Jeremy told me you were here, Sylvia explained simply. Greta turned to Diego. And you told him? Diego shrugged with his phone in one hand. In a split second, his thumb typed out a message and sent it, presumably to Jeremy. He hadn't seen you yet and wanted to know how you were doing. He wasn't going to barge in unless you wanted to see him, and in my defense, he said nothing about passing along the news. Greta sighed. Sorry I didn't come see you after I got out. I assumed you would be busy, as I am now. Sorry to hear that, but we need to talk. Can you take a minute? Sylvia looked pointedly at the database screen, knowing full well that this wasn't urgent, and letting Greta know that she knew. Okay, fine, Greta said, very much dreading the conversation. Somehow she felt invaded that Sylvia had butted into her mission, or her mission time. I've postponed the burial. You what? I've postponed the burial, Sylvia repeated icily. Why? Why would you keep him waiting? Partly because we're all so busy, but mostly so there's plenty of time for an autopsy. Greta's fists clenched tighter. He's not having an autopsy. Sylvia ignored her. The rest of us are in agreement and think it would be best for the long term. Once Dr. Phelps is done, then we can have the burial. He's not being autopsied, Greta fairly shouted. I'm his next of kin. I get to decide. Don't you think that's a decision the whole family should make? Sylvia asked in a dangerously soft voice. How can you even think of letting them cut up Jack? Greta pleaded. To help you, Sylvia exclaimed. To help all of us in the long run, but especially to help you now. No one's excited about this, but it's the right move, and we can still honor his memory afterwards. Greta clenched her teeth. None of them understood. I'm not approving it, and that's final. Sylvia crossed her arms and played the card she had prepared before she came in. He's under Dr. Phelps' care now, and I won't have the burial until there is an autopsy. Greta held back what would have practically been a shriek. In a much quieter tone, reeking with anger, she said, How dare you hold him hostage over this? It's not him anymore, Sylvia said coldly. It's just a shell. Greta, Diego said, putting a hand on her shoulder. I think it's what Jack... You aren't his family, Greta snapped. Immediately she could see the hurt in Diego's eyes. He had been on the Stormbreakers with Captain Cosmos for a long time, and everyone on the team was close. They were practically family, and Greta knew she crossed the line. Still, she was so sick of everyone else telling her what Jack would have wanted. Greta, Sylvia rebuked. Greta stared back at her coldly, fed up with her acting superior. And if this is what you want to do, then you never loved him, she said. In another world, in some parallel universe, within a split second after the words had left Greta's mouth, Sylvia slapped her with enough force to break the wall behind her. But in this one, Sylvia was as disciplined as anyone and had come in expecting a fight. Still, her fingers twitched just noticeably at the accusation. Several biting remarks, ultimatums, or simple statements flew through her mind as options to retort. She decided on none of them. None adequately expressed her outrage without blowing her top, and she wasn't sure that if she spoke, she'd say what she intended to. Instead, she simply turned on her heel and walked shortly out the door, not even closing it for fear she would destroy it. Greta didn't move for a long time. She heard Diego stir, but before he could say anything, she spun around. Thanks for your help, Diego, she said quickly and shakily. I think I can take it from here if you could just send me the files for the suspects we have pulled up right now. Diego was about to say something, thought better of it, and just nodded. That night, Greta was sitting on a bed in a safe house. She didn't much feel like going back to the Alhross Manor and chance a run-in with Sylvia or Jeremy. Instead, she would stay here for a night or two while she worked over her list of suspects. Although, she was having a hard time actually working. Sylvia's words kept ringing in her ears, and the thought of her keeping Captain Cosmos from being buried over this stupid fight. Sylvia didn't have to do this, and Greta wasn't upset just because Sylvia disagreed with her, but because of all the ways that she had gone about trying to change her mind. I mean, Greta probably wouldn't change her mind, but maybe she might consider... Well, how could she consider such a thing? Either way, what Sylvia had done was below the belt and just flat out wrong. Greta wasn't sure that Sylvia could even do this legally, but she had been the one to start arranging the burial. If Greta did have the right to bury Jack's body, and she did arrange something else, it would be ruining what was supposed to be a solemn occasion. Instead of honoring Jack, it would just be part of this petty fight. And if Sylvia showed up, she'd better, hypothetically, it would just be a cold war between the two, and it would be almost as bad as keeping him from being buried in the first place. The thoughts kept going round and round in her head as she pretended to read through the various files. Realizing she was getting nowhere, Greta forced herself to concentrate and narrow down the choices. She had decided earlier it probably wasn't the smartest tactic, but she needed to make this feel more achievable so she could feel like she was making progress on getting it done. That way her mind wouldn't wander. The more she felt she was making progress with each file, the easier it would be. One obvious choice, she realized, was to sort by who likely had access to Xenocyte. That split the list in half, but even at a glance Greta knew some of these listed as having likely access really wasn't so much likely as vaguely possible. She was about to narrow it down further when one of the discarded files caught her eye. It was for a woman who called herself Karma. Greta had heard of her but never met her. She caught her eye because Karma wasn't known for being a sniper. No, she was known for her ability to put on any face and hence disguise herself as anyone in the world. Greta pulled open the file. There was her normal appearance, caught in a candid snapshot as she walked through a supposedly secure building. Without a disguise, her face looked like it had been painted on, with bright red lips and purple eyeshadow under her strangely translucent purple hair. Greta wondered for a moment if she really did paint on her face. Maybe she didn't have a face, and that's why she could disguise herself so well. Scanning through the file, there was nothing to suggest that, but stranger things had happened with supers. Karma was only a mild super, with her appearance changing being her only notable power. She could change her proportions and height slightly in addition to her face, but she couldn't transform radically, like make herself appear as a linebacker, for example. As she scanned, underneath the long list of aliases and identities Karma had assumed, Greta also found a section about her marksmanship. Apparently, in one of her disguises, she had won a sharpshooting contest at extreme range, something that the file noted she couldn't fake. Those organizing the competition also had strict regulations and investigated after they had been informed a criminal had entered, yet found no evidence of cheating. Given that information, an addendum had been added to the file, listing a few assassinations done with high-powered rifles, like those used in the competition, and which couldn't be explained until sophisticated infiltration was considered a possibility. If these were her work, and that was a big if, she had a significant ability that needed highlighting. But try as Greta might, she couldn't find any connection to herself or any of the other Ashvelians on the planet. It seemed everything Karma was involved in, or suspected of being involved in, had virtually nothing connecting her with the Alhrosses. And yet, some of the shots Karma had taken in what were supposedly her assassinations stood out, like one in which she had taken out a banker in his private plane while it was taxiing down the runway. Not only did she account for the movement of the plane, but also any wind kicked up from the engines, which were forward of the banker's seat. To make the shot, she also had to infiltrate a high-security office building that had windows facing the side of the plane, which showed excellent planning. Witnesses in the building heard the shot, but security found no sign of the sniper's presence aside from an open window. There was no motive that Greta could see, but the things she had done. Greta couldn't help but feel like she had found a missing piece of a puzzle. She felt it in her gut. Then she checked her last known location, New Haven, Connecticut, spitting distance from Empire City. If she wanted to, she could head there now, though it would probably be hard to track down a master of disguise in an entire city. But then again, Greta had an idea. It had been a bit tricky breaking into Griffin Industries' private airport, but the Alhross' long rivalry with Anton had taught them a few tricks about getting past his security. Greta was keeping low and in the shadows, scouting the area out. The small airport was also in New Haven, mostly a stopover for longer Griffin Industry flights that wouldn't do to land in a more public setting. The way Greta figured it, there were two possibilities. First, Karma, assuming Karma was responsible, had been hired by Anton Griffin. Sure, Gorger said Griffin wasn't behind it, but like Diego had suggested, Griffin could be keeping this one extra top secret, which is why he might have hired someone new, someone he hadn't used before. Second, Karma might not have been working for Anton, but needed Xenocyte, and maybe she needed more Xenocyte now. Her file didn't indicate she had a ready supply, so if she really wanted to kill some of the Alhrosses, she'd need more. And who is most likely to have Xenocyte they'd be willing to sell? None other than Anton Griffin, of course. It was all still very shaky, but Greta had a hunch. Karma might not be involved, and she might not be looking to get more xenocyte for another attempt after Greta had survived the first one. But doing something felt a lot better than sitting and staring at a computer. So, on the off chance that it was Karma who had taken the shot, and that she would be needing more xenocyte, Greta decided to check it out. And wouldn't you know, tonight it looked like it was going to pay off. As the plane was being loaded up on the runway, Greta saw her. Karma, in her purple armor/costume, was also boarding the plane. That was going to be trouble. Now that she was in the plane, Greta would have a hard time silently and secretly extracting her. She considered waiting for her to exit, but saw that the plane was preparing for takeoff. If Karma didn't exit the plane, she would have missed her chance. She needed a plan. She also couldn't see one at the moment. After racking her brain for a few minutes, she realized she was running out of time. The plane was almost done being loaded in the early morning hours. Greta saw the sky turn a slightly brighter shade of navy. Whatever her plan would be, step one would be getting on the plane. So that's what she did. Using the smallest amount of energy, she made tiny air cushions from her feet to ensure her silence. She found a crate that was about to be loaded, checked that there was enough room, and slipped inside. The forklift loaded it quickly, apparently unaware of the stowaway. She stayed in the crate for a few minutes as the last items were loaded. As soon as she heard the cargo doors slam closed, she slipped from the crate. It had been a good hiding spot, but it meant she was blind to what was going on outside of it, and she needed her wits about her. She had decided that she would ride the plane to its destination and leave along with Karma, taking her out silently wherever the plane happened to land. There was no way she could do something in midair. Greta crouched between a couple of containers and sat as still as she could. She heard and felt the engines rev up, and within 10 minutes the plane soared down the runway and then lifted into the air. Greta worried for a second about whether she'd be able to breathe or not, but was pretty sure this cabin was pressurized. Perhaps Griffin was transporting sensitive materials that needed the extra care. Whatever the reason, Greta was suddenly thankful for it. So recently out of the hospital, it couldn't have been good even for an Ashvelian to undergo dramatic pressure changes. Greta settled in, unsure of where the plane would take her, but sure that it would be a long trip. It would be a few hours before she had to do much. Every hour or so she adjusted her legs, and suddenly she pushed the container to her left as hard as she could. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what had set her off, but she had learned to trust her instincts. Jack had drilled into them that there were a certain list of priorities on a mission. In covert operations, staying concealed was number 2 for them. For special forces or more crazy heroes it might be number 1, but not for the Alhrosses. For them, number 1 was always stay alive. And with a dangerous assassin and a potential load of xenocyte on board, if you had to act, you should act immediately. And so Greta didn't waste time. As soon as she had pushed the container, she rolled to the next one and then went around the corner, looking down the center aisle of the plane, trying to get a view of the situation. She had been right. There was Karma with a gun, sure to have xenocyte rounds in it. Acting on instinct, Greta raised a hand and released a concussive beam to pin her to the wall. But Karma was fast. Even after being knocked off balance by the container that had been pushed into her, she was already recovering, and stepped backwards out of the way of the blast. Greta didn't wait. As Karma took cover behind another container, Greta prepared to leap over it and surprise her. But in her haste, she forgot how the shockwaves from her 2 feet would cancel out. Unused to her new condition, instinct and training took over. Instead of flying over the container, she only leaped towards it, and feeling a mixture of embarrassment and panic, quickly pushed that one back as well, hoping to trap Karma behind it. No luck. Karma was already swinging around the side and aiming the gun at Greta. On impulse, Greta fired a laser beam from her eyes, but she hadn't had time to focus in. Karma's shot went wild, but she dived behind cover of another container across the way to avoid Greta's equally wild shot. Greta kicked off with only 1 foot this time, diving back to the right side of the plane just like Karma, and diving behind yet another box. Realizing that neither of them had the drop on the other, Greta once more used her silent running technique. She slipped to the next container where she thought Karma had been, but wasn't surprised to see that she had since moved. And just before she could pull the trigger, Greta leaped up and grabbed Karma's arm with the gun. The shot went off, nowhere near the two of them, but puncturing a hole in the plane. The wind rushing out wasn't as dramatic as Greta feared, but did make quite a racket. When Greta heard the slight movement above her, she realized what Karma had done. Karma had also silently changed position, but she chose to get on top of the container to ambush Greta. Unfortunately for her, quiet as she was, Greta was attuned for a fight and wasn't really expecting to find her when she turned the corner. Indeed, she was focusing more on trying to gain any clues as to where Karma might have gone, so the tiny sound as the assassin took aim was all she needed. Now in Greta's grip, Karma stood no chance. Greta quickly grabbed the gun with her free right hand, ejected the magazine, and set it aside. Turning back to Karma, she said, "Hey lady, we need to talk." "I surrender," Karma immediately replied, seeing the futility of the situation, and she went limp. She of course knew that the worst thing she could do is provoke an Ashvelian in close proximity, and quickly establishing that she was no longer a threat was the best way to ensure her own well-being. Before Greta could bark out an answer, a strip of metal flew out towards the two of them, wrapping itself around Greta's left arm and Karma's right, which Greta was still clasping tightly. Even as Greta tried releasing Karma to get away from the thing, it tightened its grip around their wrists and rotated around. Suddenly, the middle section, the piece between their arms, constricted until its two sides touched, and then the pieces of the strange worm-like device fell away. It revealed a pair of meticulously designed handcuffs, now binding Greta and Karma together. Greta shot a look towards the forward section of the cargo area and saw a guard with this strange-looking weapon that must have just fired the handcuff worm thing. Greta immediately fired a blast from her eyes at the man, intending to destroy the weapon and to knock him down, but he was already in retreat. Karma yanked at the handcuffs and exclaimed, "Let me go! This wasn't part of the plan!" Before Greta could answer, an all-too-familiar voice broke out over a speaker, and Greta realized it was to him that Karma had directed her comment. "My apologies," Anton Griffin said. "I would normally apprehend trespassers and thieves in a more civilized fashion, but we are in a rather critical condition, aren't we?" "Griffin, Greta started but was cut off. "I now understand who stole some of my xenosite, Karma, and I don't appreciate that." "Oh, you have got, but my cards have been fired upon and this aircraft damaged, and both you and this Ashvelian, you are trespassing on private property without a warrant and putting my crew in jeopardy. You both are still unsecured and capable of doing serious damage. I will give you one chance." "You really think you can get away with this setup?" Karma called. "Raise your hands and surrender, and we'll apprehend you for landing. But I warn you, if you refuse, because our lives are in danger, I will do whatever necessary to protect myself, my aircraft, and my crew." "Is that some kind of threat?" Greta shouted over the wind noise. But Karma had stopped trying to negotiate and raised her hands. "Just do it. He's not bluffing. I'm not giving in to Griffin. I give you one last chance. You have 5 seconds to surrender." "What choice do you have?" 5. "We take this plane." 4. Greta started advancing towards the cockpit, dragging Karma with her. "No, wait!" 3. "This is hostile action. I have no choice." Anton clearly saw Greta marching forward, and before either of them could do anything, the rear cargo door was flung open. Greta reacted immediately, trying to slam her hand into the floor of the plane to punch a handhold, but before she could, she was struck by one of the crates, all of which had suddenly come loose. Before she could reassess, she found herself falling through the sky, Karma handcuffed to her, and unable to fly. And with that, Part 2 of Child of the Stars, Woman of the World comes to a close. Join us next time to see if Greta and Karma can survive their perilous fall, and even if they do, if they can survive now handcuffed to each other. Will Greta finally learn the truth behind the attempt on her life? And what will she do to Karma? Or what will Karma do to her? Join us to find out next time on the Mirage Barrage.